Today, we start our video with the story of old days when you couldn't use a landline. There were a few ways to talk to others. At first, there were big and expensive radiophones. They were bulky and stayed in one place all the time. Later on, cell phones came out. One type looked like a small box, similar to a cigar box. It had a part you hold like a regular phone, a base that looked like the box, and a battery pack to carry it around. My battery was the same as the one in my portable video camera from the early 80s. You could attach a short antenna or a longer one with a magnetic base on the top of your vehicle for better signal, like those old CB antennas. People got really excited when these phones first came out. They weren't expensive, and if you were outside or in the field, you could contact others and get work done without needing to find a landline. Even back then, there were payphones available for communication. The next story is about a Judge Smith. On my way to work, there's a road with 3 lanes and many traffic signals, controlling intersections with small side streets. Most side streets had a delay before their signal turned red, which was good because it usually helped right turners, since I live in a state where you can turn right on a red light, and didn't cause traffic jams. But there was this one signal that instantly turned red, creating huge traffic backups on the main road. I thought it couldn't be a coincidence that the neighborhood connected to this signal was wealthier, and a lot of important city people lived there. After a few days of dealing with traffic jams, I decided to investigate. I looked into the city directory, made some smartphone calls, and eventually discovered a small department in the city maintenance division. I left a message saying, "Hello Bill, this is Judge Smith. I wanted to thank you for changing the signal at First and Grand. It really made my drive to court much easier. However, I must apologize and ask you to change it back to the old way. You see, my nanny comes from North Grand, and she's facing delays, making me late to court on Monday. It was worth a try, but I genuinely believe the old way was better. Please pass my thanks to Jim, your boss, and I'm really sorry for any trouble caused." In another story, a person is telling his story. It's not a story of revenge on me, but rather on one of my dad's hunting buddies. I heard this tale from someone else, so I might not have all the details. Here's what I know. A group of 4 friends gathered to plan their yearly hunting trip. This year, it was Tim's turn to drive the 12-hour journey north. The night before the trip, they got together, packed their bags, loaded up the truck with all their gear, and planned to hit the road early in the morning. They woke up at 4 a.m., had breakfast, and began their journey. However, just 2 hours into the drive, they got pulled over. To Tim's surprise, the officer informed him that both the trailer and his truck had expired tags. The cop was kind enough to offer a deal. If Tim went to the local Service Ontario, DMV, to renew his plates, he wouldn't receive any tickets. It sounded like a great deal. It was now 6 a.m., so they waited in the DMV parking lot until it opened at 8 a.m. However, when they returned at 8:15 a.m., the place was still closed. Frustrated, they went for a second breakfast and came back at 8:30 a.m., only to find the place packed. Tim was about the 15th person in line, and the frustration among the group was building. Meanwhile, the other 3 guys were in the truck, having drinks and cursing Tim. Inside the DMV, Tim observed one employee, as Tim described her, a rather robust lady, taking her time, being rude and unfriendly while dealing with elderly people. Every second person she got up and waddled past the waiting people to the peanut machine at the entrance, deposited her quarter, gathered the dispensed peanuts, and slowly waddled back to her desk. She ate the peanuts as she talked, causing everyone in the room to boil with anger. By around 11 a.m., after the 3rd trip for peanuts, Tim couldn't take it anymore. He got up, walked over to the peanut dispenser, lifted it off the ground, carried it to the side of her desk, and placed it down to save her the trip. Surprisingly, she said nothing and took the next person in line. Finally clearing the 4 people in front of Tim, he approached the counter, excited to leave and get back on the road. But before he could say anything, she quietly pulled out a sign from under the counter and placed it on the desk. The sign read, "Gone for lunch. Be back at 12 o'clock." I'm not sure about the words exchanged after this, but I imagine they weren't pleasant. Despite the delay, they eventually went on the hunting trip, delayed by about 8 hours. They still wonder if the cop knew what he was getting them into. Next, Mike is telling his story. My mom is the highest level of a failed parent. When I was 2, my baby brother, Mark, was born. As a typical 2-year-old, I didn't like that and proceeded to act out in regards to it. As time went on, though, I learned from my grandfather and grandmother that treating someone like that wasn't a good idea, and then turned my act around to love and care for him, and help out where I could. However, this didn't change much. My mother basically threw me away to be raised by my grandparents because I was a demonic hell spawn of a child. In her mind, her new child was latest greatest, and I was just old news. Let's time skip. My mother has now had her 4 kids, Mark and I with my dad, and Sam and Alicia with my stepfather. I'm about 13, Mark 11, Alicia is about 1.5, and Sam was just born. Mom and Dad are divorced. Mom married Stepdad, and I am at the rebellious age now where things don't make sense to me, and I feel like I know everything, so my stepdad's idea is to beat it out of me. Every time I showed any sense of individuality or questioning something, I got beat for it. Sometimes right in front of my mother, and she didn't care a bit. This is where the trigger for me wanting my revenge started, but being 13 and sadly, a little on the mentally damaged side from all of the beatings, and having a bookcase full of books land on me at around 11, I had no concept of what sort of revenge would come from my mind at the time. So I decided that waiting would be best. Mom's mistake one has been made. On top of that, my mother and stepdad refused to do any housework. Instead, waiting for the weekend when Grandma and Grandpa would leave to visit Grandma's mother, and put us to work cleaning the house and doing stuff adults should be doing. Now, I get the concept of chores. Chores are fine. It's when you make your child climb ladders and get on the roof at the age of 11 to clean out gutters, or climb trees to snip branches, and such that it gets a bit too dangerous. This happened since I was about 10. Yes, I know, things are a little out of order. I'll keep on track. Time skipped to when I'm 14. My mother told me and Mark to watch Alicia. She was 2 by this time. Stepdad wanted to play video games, and when we weren't being bad in his eyes, he'd let us watch, but we were never allowed to play without him there watching us. I pop up while I'm sitting there and ask, "Where is Alicia?" Full-blown panic mode go. Mark and I just up and go scoring through the house. Stepdad goes to check my mom's room where she's sleeping with Sam who she was up with all night. My dad was in the kitchen making himself something to eat, while he was visiting then freaked out and burnt his hand on the stovetop when everyone started freaking out, then started searching. Mark and I ran out back and looked around, saw nothing, didn't even think to check the pool, so we ran back inside and rummaged through the garage. Next thing we hear my mother screaming at the top of her lungs, and we rush outside to find Alicia on the deck, not breathing, and my mother and stepdad trying to perform CPR on her. My father drags Mark and I away to go inside, and the ambulance is called. Needless to say, Alicia did not survive, and they pulled the plug on her that night. Mom's mistake, too, has been made. Mark and I were devastated, being the teenager I was and the preteen he was. We immediately blamed ourselves, and our grandparents assured us that it wasn't our fault or responsibility, and that we need to know this isn't on us. A week later, Child Protective Services got word and came, and my father, in his infinite wisdom, initiated a custody battle with my mother after this, claiming she wasn't capable of caring for her children, and won, temporarily. Needless to say, our grandparents believed we belongs with our mother, and fought back. My mom ultimately won us back. Time skip. I'm 18 now. I'm an adult. I'm looking to graduate high school and make my mark on the world and get my life going. Mark was 15 now, had gotten into a fight and broke his finger. It had to be repaired with pins and screws, and was on some pretty hefty pain medicine. I don't remember the name. It was my mother's job to watch him and regulate his pain medicine so nothing bad would happen. Sadly, that bad thing did happen. Grandfather picked me up from school one day, and I could see he had a gloomy look on his face. We showed up to the house, and as we were walking up, I could see the paramedics rolling a stretcher with a body bag on it. Mark had died from a drug overdose at the age of 15 because my mother wasn't watching him like she should have been. That was the final straw. At that moment, my family was divided, my dad's side and my mother's side. My mother had my grandparents, who I was living with at the time, and my father had me and his family. I sided with my father completely, his argument being that had she been a better mother, Mark would still be alive, and what's worse, Sam had been taken away by CPS, Child Protective Services, and put in foster care. My mother was never allowed to raise children again, and I never saw my half-brother ever again. I was now an only child. My mother had destroyed the life I knew with her neglect, so I was going to ruin the rest of her life any way I could. Revenge time. This woman caused the deaths of 2 of my siblings, and I never got to see my living half-sibling again. Abused me mentally, emotionally, physically, took away my childhood, and every time I look at her, I can't help but seethe with unmitigated rage. The first revenge. My grandfather had basically been my best friend. He took me in, cared for me, taught me all sorts of different skills. He had one flaw, though: he was too kind for his own good. Something my mother maliciously preyed on after the deaths in the family. My grandmother gave up hope and just diverted to his opinion on everything. So I made it a point that every time she tried, I challenged her on it in front of them, made sure she had to fight for what she wanted. I always lost, but I could see my constant meddling would get to her, irritate her. I wanted her to do something. I wanted her to hit me, harm me, give me a single reason. She never went that far, but she did break down crying multiple times. Then I got lucky. She slipped at work, herniated a few of her discs, and messed her back up really badly. When I got the news, I grinned. Around this time, my stepdad had been imprisoned for doctor shopping, and my mother wanted a divorce from him. When she came home from the hospital, I would take her meds and hide them around the house, and sometimes even throw them away. I wanted her to be in agony. I wanted her to suffer as much as possible, and she did. A few months later, she got into a car wreck, and the police found out she was on a hefty amount of her pain meds. She was charged with a DUI and put in jail for 6 months. I grinned and laughed once I got that news and proceeded to planning my next stage. She was in pain and behind bars. This was perfect. The second revenge. Time skip again. After she got out of jail, we'll skip ahead a few years. She's now living with us. I'm officially in college. I did the stupid thing and took a year off between high school graduation and applying to a college. So my grandparents made me a deal. As long as I worked and was in school, I could stay with them free of charge. Who wouldn't take that deal? While my mother was in jail, I made it a point to shove all of her property into a storage and made her room my room, and turned my old living space into my gaming room. She had no choice but to sleep on the couch. I enjoyed every moment of her agonizing, which she would get up from laying on the couch. Agonizing caused the metal bars on it would press into her back as she slept. This was my revenge for some time, slow and painful. The third revenge, time skip. We moved back to the old house we were all living in, and my mother has made her back worse through a series of mistakes and bad decisions. She had somehow convinced my grandparents to start illegally procuring drugs for her. She would make the connection with the dealer, and they would shell out money to her for them. I argued with my grandparents to stop. It was illegal, and it will land them all in jail if they get caught. My grandfather agreed, but my grandmother couldn't help but take care of her little girl, and guilted my grandfather into it. I refused to be a part of it. I put in an anonymous tip into local law enforcement, but sadly nothing came of it. My revenge had failed this time. But I didn't know I would get the ultimate screw you in, 'cause it came in the form of my most malicious, vindictive statement ever spoken. Plus, I was still messing with her hiding her medications. It's childish, but sometimes you have to be a bit childish to get the point across. The final revenge. I am 31 now. It has been 13 agonizing years since my brother Mark died, and I have finally completed my revenge on my mother. My grandfather just passed last year, and I have been saving a veritable buttload of cash from over the years in jobs. I worked inheritance, form other deaths in the family, and so on. I went to visit my grandmother, who's not been in great shape since my grandfather passed and her dog passed, about 6 months after that. My mother comes out to me while we're sitting there talking and asks if I will take care of her after Grandma was gone, that it was my duty as her son. She was broke. My grandmother was going into a retirement home, and my mother blew through her inheritance with her dealings. The rest was going to me. I knew it for a fact. I stood up, and while I stared my mother directly in the eyes, I managed the most hateful, vicious stare I could muster. It wasn't hard. And told her, "You get nothing from me. Grandma's going into a retirement home. I'm moving states. You destroyed my life, took away my childhood, were responsible for the deaths of my siblings, broke the law numerous times, and you made everyone's lives a living hell. You will be on the street and die alone, and I will laugh. I never loved you, and I never will. You will never see your grandchildren if slash when there are any. You will not be at my wedding. You will never be mother to me again. Rot in hell." My grandmother's jaw hit the floor, and my mother burst into tears. I had finally broken her and got my revenge. It may not seem like much to you all, but that moment was heavenly for me. It felt amazing to finally know I've gotten my ultimate revenge after all of these years, and damned her to suffering. My grandmother is going into that retirement home in about 3 months, and I'm helping her move her stuff, so there will be no chance of her little girl weaseling her way out of her fate. After that, I'm moving to a new state and starting my new life with a new job and wonderful girlfriend who I love more than anything. For those of you who have brothers and sisters, love them, cherish them, and be with them, 'cause you never know what's going to happen. This revenge was born of me losing my siblings, the one thing I loved most in this world. Being an older brother was the happiest time in my life, and after they died and Sam was taken by CPS, I have had to suffer as an only child and still cry myself to sleep at night over it. It was traumatizing, so please cherish your siblings. Thank you for reading. EDIT. After sitting down and reading again, I have realized that I labeled Sam and Alicia wrong. They are my half-siblings, not my step-siblings. Same mom, different dad.